Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, and to this, the third in a series of programmes about Ireland, and in particular, the impact on Ireland of Brexit. In our last two programmes, Alex has conducted major interviews with former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern and new leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou McDonald. Today, he speaks to Mary Mcaleese, a woman from the north of Ireland who became the 8th Uachtaran, or President of Ireland. She's in an unrivalled position to comment, not just on the economic progress of Ireland, but also on the social development of the country in recent years. Alex will then discuss what we have learned from all three interviews with Professor John Tong of Liverpool University. However, first, to your tweets, your messages and your emails. We're really pleased at the great interest the special series on Ireland has generated, particularly in relation to some of your tweets, messages and emails that we've received. Just a few here. Terry says, speaks of actually Theresa May's Nightmare on Elm Street. Says it's another great show and feels he learned something. Well, we're really pleased to hear that, Terry, and hope you keep watching. Fiona Brown says, great interview, referring of course to the interview with Bertie Ahern last week. By allowing interviewees to speak, viewers get the essence of the person. Alex Salmond clearly has a talent for both listening and framing reasonable questions. Love the show. Great stuff. Jimmy says, great Alex Salmond interview with Bertie Ahern today. Broad in scope. Alistair says, just caught up on the recent edition of the Alex Salmond Show. Great work. Really enjoying these episodes. And lastly from Fiona, who says, loving this show. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you, Fiona, and I hope you keep watching. And viewers, please do get in touch with us with any ideas you have for the show. We'd love to hear from you. Now, Mary Mcaleese was growing up in the north of Ireland when the Troubles started in the 1960s. She was President of Ireland when the Good Friday Agreement secured the peace in 1998. No one has a stronger personal investment in the peace process. So over to Alex and Mary Mcaleese in Dublin.
St Stephen's Green, Dublin, and the statue of Wolfe Tone, leader of the United Irishmen. But 200 years and more later, what are the consequences of Brexit Britain for the prospects of a united Ireland? I speak to Mary Mcaleese, for 14 years Uachtaran, or President of this Republic. What she has to say makes fascinating listening. Mary Mcaleese, you were the first President Uachtaran of Ireland, who was born in the north of Ireland. So you have a great personal as well as a political investment in the peace process. How much of a threat do you see to the peace process from what's happening with Brexit in Britain?
The peace process took really 3 decades to bring to any kind of fruition. The Good Friday Agreement in 1998 really was a 30-year job. I remember as a teenager when war broke out on my doorstep in 1968-69 and thinking it would last a week, but it lasted 30 years. So it took 30 years to take a small community, which is only 1.5 million people, to construct a really very sophisticated agreement that would secure the future in terms of peace and partnership. That agreement was predicated upon membership of the European Union. It was never in anybody's thinking that at some time one of the parties, one of the major parties, would withdraw from the Union. What I'm saying is the Good Friday Agreement, on which the peace is dependent, is not stress tested against a time when the British remove themselves, the United Kingdom removes itself from the European Union. I described Brexit as trying to pull a tooth with 10,000 roots. And that's exactly what it is. It's very messy. But one of the most obvious consequences of our peace process is that the militarised hard border between north and south that we used to have has evaporated. The only way you know that you've crossed the border is when Vodafone pings you to tell you that you have crossed an international border. It makes commerce easy, it makes trade, tourism easy, it makes friendships easy, mutual use of each other's services, whether it's health services, education services, whatever. All so much easier now, thanks to what? Membership of the European Union linked to the Good Friday Agreement.
If Vodafone can ping Mary Mcaleese when she crosses the border,
yes,
surely it must be a technical solution in the 21st century to avoid having customs posts, even if the UK decides to stay out of the customs union?
It's not just customs posts, after all. I mean, it's much more complex than just having customs posts. But may I say that the very idea of having customs posts of any sort, shape or description, whether they are by camera or ping, whatever, that does fill me with dread, precisely because we have enjoyed, from after the Good Friday Agreement, we've enjoyed a period of calm and peace with relatively little violence. And we have managed to cut the umbilical cord between public support and the paramilitaries. Now, my worry is, of course, that some of the paramilitaries, the smaller operations, have not gone away. They do not enjoy public support, but give them a cause. And that cause could be a camera on a border. It could be a mobile patrol on a border. Because here's the thing. We now enjoy a completely open and free border. After Brexit, whatever we get will be less than that.
Do you think that UK politicians, the Prime Minister Theresa May, David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, the new Northern Irish Secretary, do you think they've become complacent, that they don't understand or appreciate just how pivotal the question of no border is between Ireland and Northern Ireland? Or is it that the political difficulties within the governing party make it impossible to reach a solution?
In fairness, I would have to say to Theresa May, she, like you, was one of the very few politicians who, during the referendum, came to Northern Ireland to warn of the dangers. One of the very few, very, very few, who bothered to take an interest in what the ramifications of Brexit for Northern Ireland. Within the European Union, within the other 27, including Ireland, the importance of the Irish border issue is very well known. The threat that Brexit poses is very well known. But I know from living in Britain, living in London during the Brexit campaign, that it was absolutely not anywhere on the agenda. It was one of the many, many things that were overlooked in the rush to an ill-prepared referendum.
Now, the Welsh First Minister and the Scottish First Minister have joined together to argue very strongly for Scotland and Wales staying within the single market context. Do you, as a former Uachtaran, have any advice for these two First Ministers on how they'd be able to pursue that objective given the political situation?
I think it would be impertinent of me to offer advice to the Scottish First Minister or the Welsh First Minister, or indeed, if we ever have one again, the Northern Irish First Minister. I will always be a believer in the fundamental integrity of the European project. And my plea to those who are in positions of leadership is to never lose sight of that great project. And there may come a time, I'd like to think there will come a time, when Britain, after it leaves the European Union, will think again and rejoin this remarkable adventure in democratic politics. The dead hand of bureaucracy, can sometimes, take the gloss off dreams. But so too can amnesia. So too can forgetting what this was always about. Because Europe is also about peace as well as prosperity. And for Ireland, it has helped to secure both for us.
Now, you're a passionate European and a great Anglophile, a great friend of Britain, but isn't there a small part of you as an Irishwoman who would appreciate that role reversal of Downing Street having to phone Dublin to get issues raised? Isn't it just an aspect?
I find it really depressing, because here's what really excited me. It excited me that we, Ireland, joined the European Union voluntarily. I used to joke it was the only union we joined voluntarily. We didn't join the United Kingdom voluntarily. But we sat around the European Union table with our former imperial colonising masters. And we sat as friends, we sat as partners, as neighbours. And over a period of time, we took all the vanities of history, and over 2 or 3 generations, we dismantled them and were able to offer our children something really humanly very decent.
Now, it's 100 years since women in the United Kingdom obtained a partial franchise, which of course was synchronised with Ireland obtaining partial freedom 100 years ago. What aspects of this Brexit process do you see as a threat to the rights and entitlements for equality that women have gained over that century?
That's a really interesting perspective, Alex, because I'm not sure that I've heard a lot of people raising that. When we go back to, and your description of women getting the vote as partial is very important. It is important to remember that when it was given to women, it was only given to women over 30 and those who had property. And that is very telling, that really over this past century, there's been still a huge amount of work to be done in terms of liberating women from all the breaking mechanisms, all the suppositions and presumptions about women's abilities that held them back from full participation in every aspect of life, whether it was access to education, the professions, politics, church, whatever. And we're still dismantling that architecture of misogyny that underpinned their exclusion from all of those. So I think it's a very important question you raise. I look at what the European Union helped us to achieve for women. Equal pay, equal right to employment. Now, I'm not saying that we've achieved any or all of those things, but they've given us, again, the infrastructure, the architectural structure to be able to navigate to those destinations, and we're on our way to those destinations. And Europe has structure that assists women, in my view. And we have to remember that much of what we take for granted today, whether it's in terms of equal opportunities, whether it's in terms of equal pay, that the arguments that we make in back of that are supported by European legislation, most of it now translated into national legislation, that we have structure. We don't just have to rely on advocacy. We have structure. And it is that structure which will create the highways to the future that women will course down. The other big issue is immigration, of course. I know that if you look back at the history of Irish immigration was to Britain was a huge boon, particularly to Irish women who could not get work at home. Take a look at Ireland. In a relatively short period of time, we who were always an emigrating nation suddenly became a nation of inward migration. Today, almost 17% of our population is non-native Irish. And they are highly educated. On average, they're better educated than us, and that's saying something because the Irish are very well educated. They have integrated very well into our community, and we, in fairness, have made a lot of efforts to make sure that they did. Why? Because our people knew what it was like to be told, no Irish need apply. And we know what it was like to have nothing except just your two hands, the one length, to work on the hod, to work in the dirty job, to work for your children so that they would get the education, they would become the doctors, the dentists, the nurses, the accountants, the politicians, the corporate sector in a generation or two generations, which is exactly what the Irish did. We know how the story of immigration ends if you give people a chance, because we were those people.
Welcome back to Dublin. I'm speaking to Mary Mcaleese, for 14 years Uachtaran, or President of Ireland. A lot has been said about Irish economic progress, a transformation in Ireland over the last generation. But looking through your political career, how would you assess the social transformation of Ireland?
The social transformation of Ireland, I think, really is rooted in the massive changes that happened in access to education from the 1960s onwards, with the opening up of second-level education free and then the massification of university education. As you know, Ireland has one of the highest rates of third-level education in its among its working people. Can I give you a simple example? My mum and dad, my dad, God rest him, my mother, were smart, but they belonged to a generation that had no chance of education. My father became a barman, my mother became a hairdresser. They would have loved to have had the chance to stay on school after 14, but it just didn't happen. When I got into university, I was the oldest of 9 children, the first of my family, to go to college. And my parents were so enthralled that they took the whole 9 of us, including the baby, who was my mother's youngest child, who was then only a matter of a few months old. They took us out to lunch. We'd never been out to lunch before. And I had just got my A-level results, so I knew I was getting into Queen's to do law in Belfast.
I hope you got a bulk discount.
Well, what happened was the girl who was serving us, came along with the menu. And I can still remember my father giving it to me, for me to order for all of us. I remember the pathos of that somehow my father felt increasingly there was a gap between him and his daughter, who was now to become an educated person, because my parents had wonder in their eyes at the idea of being in the company of educated people. They, up until then, they were really, the only educated people they were under the thumb of really were the local clerics. And so now, for them, the idea that their daughter was going into that world was an extraordinary phenomenon. Now, I take that, the image of that, and that for me was the watershed in Ireland, because everybody around us was first generation into university. Everybody around us suddenly had kids who were becoming whatever their parents had never had a hope of being, we now could become and did become. The culture that we came from, the religion that we came from, the underpinning value systems that we came from, we now had the tools for interrogating that to ensure that those things were consonant with the other parallel track we were living with, which was the European Convention on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the realization that, for example, that we as women or Catholics or blacks or whatever, that we were the equal of anybody and everybody. And everybody was entitled to respect. If we wanted respect, we had to give it. That systems that had grown up around disrespect, around elites, the hold, for example, of the churches in Ireland diminished greatly. And there's an irony in that, because I and most of the people around me who have the benefit of education got that education thanks to the churches we belonged to. In my case, it was the Dominican nuns and the Mercy nuns, you know, who gave me access to the education that got to me to where I am now. It's a kind of an irony to me that that same church that gave me my education simply cannot cope with educated women, it seems, or at least the hierarchy of the church can't cope with educated women. They are terrified of them. But that's a good thing too, because that proves the probative power of interrogation that we were given, the powers of analysis that ensure that we're always seeking to refresh, and that the destiny we see is a destiny of equals.
And the future of Irish women and the future of Ireland, basically strong?
I think the future of Ireland is really very, very strong. When I think of what we coped with during the years when the Celtic Tiger disappeared and the huge problems that that produced for everybody, particularly people left with huge debts and people who lost their jobs, and having come from a time when it looked as if we had actually cracked forever the problems of outward migration and poverty and employment or underemployment and unemployment. For one golden moment when the Celtic Tiger was in its, you know, when it was at a very advanced stage, we felt the power of what Ireland could be when everything was working well for us. Then that all fell away. It was a diabolical lesson, and the hardship that people endured. But then they endured it, you know, with something approaching, you know, real equanimity, real stoicism, extraordinary stoicism. And we've now come through it, still with casualties, but we're through the worst of it, in my view now. And in the doing of that, I think the social solidarity that we have is really, it's an exemplary thing. I'm very fortunate. My 3 children, who've all been away, have all lived away at some time or been away at some time, all tell me that by comparison with all the places in the world they have either lived or have studied, that they would live nowhere else but the great city of Dublin.
Mary Mcaleese, thank you so much. Just one thing. For being on the Alex Salmond Show, you get the quaich, which is the cup of kindness. As you know, the whiskey goes in the quaich, obviously Scotch best, but there are good Irish whiskies as well. And then only to your close friends.
Oh, thank you. My late father would have adored this, though I have to say, on his deathbed, when we asked him what advice he wanted to give the 9 children gathered round his bed, waiting for him to die, he said, "Jemieson's is your only man."
Mary Mcaleese, thank you so much.
A pleasure.
And now to discuss the interview with Mary Mcaleese, and indeed the 3 interviews in our Irish series, I'm joined by Professor John Tong, Professor of British and Irish Politics at the University of Liverpool. John, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. Now, looking at the Mary Mcaleese interview, I mean, she in some senses personifies the peace process. A teenager growing up in Belfast when the Troubles started, rose to become President of Ireland at a time basically of the peace process being established and of great economic and social progress. How right is she to be worried about the Brexit threat to all of that progress?
Well, you sense from the interview with Mary Mcaleese her frustration at the way that Brexit threatens to derail a very carefully constructed peace process. Mary Mcaleese was part of that peace process generation. Having lived through a conflict, she came to appreciate greatly, as did her children, the benefits of relative peace in Northern Ireland. And she seems monumentally frustrated at how Brexit threatens to derail that. She seemed baffled at the fact that anyone could risk such a carefully constructed process by an act of economic self-harm from a British point of view and from an Irish point of view. As she points out, what about the Good Friday Agreement? That's the question that's not been answered. The Good Friday Agreement is an international treaty. It's registered at the United Nations. It can't simply be changed at the stroke of a pen. And strand 2 of that agreement, the all-Ireland dimension, you would simply have to rewrite it to accommodate the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. As Mary Mcaleese said, the Good Friday Agreement was predicated upon the UK and Ireland being part of that European Union. The implications of Brexit are very profound for both nations.
And thinking, let's have a look at the other 2 interviews, just snatches from them, and see what Bertie Ahern and Mary Lou McDonald had to say. I mean, does Theresa May or David Davis, even the new Northern Irish Secretary, are they complacent because there's been that period of comparative peace in Ireland?
We tried hard in the Brexit debate to get the Irish message over. I went to some of the universities and lectures, and the dead then Taoiseach went over to some debates. But the reality is, Alex, that none of them cared 2 hoots about Northern Ireland. It was no longer an issue. It wasn't one of the top 3 stories as it was for generations in the news.
30 years of troubles, 20 years of peace. But of course now a Brexit process, which some people believe is a fundamental danger to the peace process. How do you evaluate that danger?
Brexit and the Good Friday Agreement are mutually incompatible. You cannot have Brexit, you cannot have a forcing of the north of Ireland out of the European Union on the one hand, and still claim to honour in word and spirit and letter the Good Friday Agreement. I think the Tories have played a very dangerous game. No way can Ireland, or should Ireland, or will Ireland be the collateral damage in the midst of all of that.
Well, firstly, Bertie Ahern, I mean, he was Taoiseach who negotiated the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, he uses words beautifully, but some of his stuff is very, very pointed.
You can understand Bertie Ahern's frustration with the way things have developed in terms of the Good Friday Agreement when you've got British ministers or former secretaries of state for Northern Ireland now recklessly saying, frankly, the Good Friday Agreement has served its time. They certainly weren't saying that when they were in office. You can understand why Bertie Ahern is virtually uttering disbelief at the way events have turned. Bertie Ahern was the man who flew up from Dublin to Belfast on the morning of his mother's own funeral to try and clinch that agreement. He put years of effort without any electoral reward in the south. People weren't voting in the 26 counties of Ireland on the basis of what was happening in the north. Bertie Ahern wasn't doing it for vainglorious reasons. He wasn't even doing it for domestic political reasons. He put a lot of effort into the peace process for the good of Ireland as a whole.
And Mary Lou McDonald, very much the emerging woman of Irish politics, she's going to be a force to be reckoned with.
Mary Lou McDonald was the obvious successor to Gerry Adams. She's very, very smart intellectually. She's very, very well attuned politically. She will lead Sinn Féin, I'm sure, to greater success. You've got to look where Sinn Féin have come from, first of all. In 1997, the year prior to the Good Friday Agreement, Sinn Féin only had a single member of Dáil Éireann. 20 years on, they're already up to 23 TDs. Under Mary Lou, I would expect Sinn Féin to continue to grow very rapidly. And I think the big attraction in terms of Mary Lou to ordinary Irish voters is she's not really associated with the Northern Irish conflict in the way that Gerry Adams was. So she's far less politically toxic, and she can, in many ways, continue to modernise Sinn Féin and lead it further and further away from those IRA roots.
This week we've seen a significant shift in the Labour Party positioning on the question of the European Customs Union. That might open up, if it's supported by a majority of MPs, as it might be, a solution to a physical border between the north of Ireland and the Republic. But many of our interviewees were suggesting this is more than about a physical border. This is almost about a psychological border. They're concerned about more than just the existence of customs posts.
Yeah, I mean, nationalists across the island of Ireland will just about accept a border as a political fact in the short and medium term, but they want a united Ireland more broadly. But they're certainly not going to accept it as a fence, not a reinvigorated one, a la the Troubles. Now, whether you have an electronic fence or whether you have a physical fence, the fact is, it's something that nationalists don't want. The only way you can get around that is to have a customs union embracing the UK and Ireland. And if there's not a bespoke UK-Ireland deal, then frankly, the UK has to stay within the customs union as the Labour Party is now proposing. There are no alternatives.
Professor John Tong, thank you so much. Just one final thing. I'm not certain about Liverpool's whisky producing qualities, but for being a guest on the show, you're entitled to the Alex Salmond Quake. It's whisky, Scotch, in the Quake, the cup of kindness passed round your many friends in Liverpool.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the interview. Thank you. Throughout all three of our programmes in Ireland, these major figures have outlined the dangers that Brexit poses to the peace process. They say the dismantling of barriers in Ireland is not just physical but psychological, and Brexit threatens that process. Interestingly, they're rather more concerned about the potential impact on the island of Ireland itself than, for example, the threat to trade and commerce between Britain and Ireland. In Westminster, the tectonic plates are also shifting. The opposition Labour Party's switch to support a European customs union this week is not just a tactical shift to place the government in a tight parliamentary corner, but a strategic move, partially justified on the basis that only such an initiative can honour the pledge to a frictionless border between the north and south of Ireland. It seems that, not for the first time in Westminster politics, what Churchill termed the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone could be crucial in determining the political balance in London. So from all of us at the Alex Salmond Show, a goodbye, and tune in next week for a special programme marking International Women's Day.